Sometimes a comeback is expected, sometimes it's a surprise. But more often than not, there will be a logic behind why a certain individual chooses to return at a certain point in time. Maybe it's the case of Triple H returning from an injury in 2002. Maybe it's CM Punk deciding to start a second career in the ring in 2021. Either way, each of these could have been predicted by many fans. But what happens when a return is so random there seems to be no rhyme or reason behind it? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us today as we take a deep dive into some of the most bizarre comebacks of them all in Random Returns, WWE's most obscure comebacks. And if we're gonna start somewhere, let's go all the way back to the Attitude Era, as it was there that, right when the likes of Steve Austin and The Rock were rising to the level of mainstream superstars, WWF would make the curious decision to bring back a star from the 80s no one was asking for, and that was George the Animal Steele. Sure, Steele may have been a popular performer during his initial run with the company in the 70s and 80s on account of his savage wildman character, but by the time the late 90s had come around, it seemed like his act was a thing of the past. That was why it was so surprising then that, on the December 29, 1997 episode of Raw, he appeared as a tag team partner for Taka Michinoku during a tag match against Brian Christopher and Jerry Lawler. Of course, his presence here immediately stuck out like a sore thumb, as it made little sense for him and Michinoku to be aligned. So maybe that was why, in the months which followed, the Animal would be given a more fitting role when he was made a member of the Oddities, with him getting to share the ring here with other freakish characters such as Giant Silva, Luna Vachon, the Insane Clown Posse, and masked figure Golga. And when it comes to the man behind that mask, like George Steele, he would have had a prior career himself in WWF during the 80s, though he was never a turnbuckle-chewing animal. No, he was Earthquake. But after his run with the Oddities ran its course in early 1999, he would disappear for a couple of years again, with him never to be seen after that until the point he showed up for the Gimmick Battle Royal at WrestleMania 17. Once back though, there would be some early discussions given towards the idea of him returning to his old gimmick. After all, if it had worked so well before, what's to say it couldn't work again? Well, the reality here was that John Tenta was a decade older by then, and so, with him having lost a step or two, combined with the fact that he'd cut a lot of weight in the intervening years and no longer had the gigantic figure required to play the role, things would be quietly dropped after the big man appeared in one dark match on a SmackDown taping soon after this. But when it came to another figure that had made a splash around about the time of Earthquake's return, well, quiet seemingly wasn't a word in his vocabulary. So when he returned in 2011 to Absolute Crickets then, it must have been a shock to his system. Who are we talking about? Grandmaster Sexay, of course. Yes, in the late 90s and early 2000s, Too Cool were one of the most popular acts on the WWF roster. And a big part of the reason for this, of course, was that with Grandmaster Sexay and Scotty 2 Hotty having Rikishi by their side, they were quickly able to dance their way from the lower mid-card right into the main event scene. But for as much as these dance breaks might have been a hit with fans, by June of 2001, Brian Christopher would end up getting released from the company as a consequence of his various drug issues. Still, as the son of Jerry the King Lawler, it felt inevitable that he would return eventually. It was just that no one expected it to happen the way it did. And how did it happen? Well, by 2011, Lawler was involved in a feud with his broadcast partner Michael Cole, with Cole playing the heel here and continually trying to get under the King's skin. So on the March 14th episode of Raw that year then, he would announce he'd convinced Grandmaster Sexay to return to WWE so as to verbally trash his father and embarrass him on live TV. The only problem with this one is that it was Christopher who ended up coming out looking the most embarrassed here, as when his music hit, rather than getting a big return pop, you could have heard a pin drop for how silent it was. Seriously, the whole thing is so eerily and hilariously quiet, it's almost as if it's a rib being played on the former Too Cool star. Needless to say then, with this comeback flopping hard, Grandmaster Sexay would not become a regular figure on WWE TV once more. No, instead, he would fade back into the ether, only showing up again for another one-time appearance a few years later. To find an example of a more successful, albeit equally as random return around this time period then, we'd have to jump forward to 2013, because it was there that Rob Van Dam surprised everyone when he was announced as a participant in that year's Money in the Bank ladder match. Of course, RVD had been a big star in the wrestling world in the years prior to this. After all, he'd first been able to hit it big during the 90s in Extreme Championship Wrestling, all before he then took that star power and successfully translated it over to WWE at the turn of the millennium. Still, by 2013, with him having been gone from the company for the last 6 years, few people expected Mr. Monday Night to make a return to Vince McMahon's promotion anytime soon. Not that it wasn't welcomed when it happened, of course, because with fans quickly getting behind him as usual, RVD was able to put on a good showing in the aforementioned Money in the Bank ladder match, with him following this up by serving as a great utility player in the months after, getting to have one-on-one encounters against the likes of Chris Jericho, Dean Ambrose, and Alberto Del Rio. That said, he felt very much just like another body on the roster here and not the star he'd once been, making it a little confusing as to why the company chose to bring him back at all. And of course, he wasn't the only former ECW star who would fall into that trap as the years went on, because not long after this, in 2016, it would be Tajiri's turn to make a random comeback when he entered himself into the company's Cruiserweight Classic tournament. But maybe this one shouldn't have been such a surprise because, with WWE's aim here to gather the best cruiserweights from all over the world and have them battle it out for supremacy, it only made sense they would bring in the Japanese Buzzsaw for a shot. Sure, he may have been a little bit older than he had been during his initial run in New York during the Attitude Era, but even in his 40s, he was still better in the ring than most. And that was because he'd kept working in the intervening years, with this allowing him to keep himself sharp enough to take on Gran Metalik in the first round of the tournament on July 14th. But while it would be the Lucha star who came out of this one on top come the end, that didn't stop Tajiri from signing a new contract with WWE soon thereafter, with him this time becoming a fixture on both 205 Live and NXT. And it was on this latter brand that he would even get the opportunity to reunite with his old tag team partner William Regal for a while. That said, any reunions would ultimately be cut short when, after suffering a knee injury in January of 2017, Vince McMahon would decide to cut bait on the former Cruiserweight champion, with him feeling like he was too old to return to the main roster at this point. Is this a little ironic given the average age of current main event mainstays like Brock Lesnar, Goldberg, and Edge? Sure, but at least they can perform to the standard which is required of them, the same of which unfortunately can't be said for another figure who returned to WWE in 2017, and that's the Great Khali. To be fair to Khali though, he was never really brought in to be an active wrestler again because, with him barely being able to move on account of his size during his first run, there was little hope he'd be able to do any better on his second. So instead, he'd made a surprise appearance at the June 23rd Battleground pay-per-view, there helping WWE champion Jinder Mahal retain his belt during a Punjabi prison match against Randy Orton. And the reason for this one appears to be that, with him being a legitimate superstar over in his native India, it was felt that bringing Khali in to give the rub to Jinder Mahal would help to get him over with that audience as the company set about doing a tour of the East. Of course, the Giant made sure to use this opportunity to get himself over too when he held up the WWE title himself at the close of the bout, and ultimately, that would contribute towards Mahal failing to get over in a big way with this audience as, when WWE did go over there for their tour later that year, they wouldn't sell as many tickets as they'd hoped. Still, Khali would get to earn another payday regardless when in 2018, he'd appear on the Saudi Arabian show The Greatest Royal Rumble. One person who would not get a Saudi return, however, would be someone who'd initially made his name as a rising star of the mid-card during the late 90s. And that's because, when Delo Brown made a surprise comeback in 2008, it never really clicked in the same way it had before. Sure, Delo could still go in the ring, and he was just as charismatic as he had been in the years prior, but similar to Rob Van Dam's later return, it felt like the company never really had any intentions of using the former Nation of Domination member as anything more than a glorified jobber to the bigger stars. That was why, after spending his first few weeks there upon his return working in dark matches, he'd finally graduate to Raw once more, where his job was to make sporadic appearances throughout the rest of the year, usually putting others over whenever he did show up. Of course, he did get the odd bone thrown his way when he picked up the occasional victory against the likes of Santino Marella, but let's be honest, Santino himself was always more of a comedy figure and never someone known for his own great win-loss record. So could Delo have been used more efficiently if he'd been pushed harder at this point? Probably. But given that there were already plenty of bodies on the roster, each of whom were vying for more TV time, it never really worked out that way, and in January of 2009, WWE would announce they had released him from his contract once more. We guess that's just what happens when you were never really a main event player during your first run, and Vince McMahon doesn't see you rising any higher. It's not like Brown is the only example of this after all. No, it was the same with two people who initially came up around the same time as him, and who WWE thought might have some added value in bringing back in during 2016, and that's the Headbangers. Yes, you may have forgotten about this one already given how brief and out of the blue it was, but not long after the brand extension had been reactivated and SmackDown was looking for duos to bolster up their tag team roster, they'd call in a group from the past with the hopes that they'd be able to get some of the more modern tag teams over. But what made this one more surprising than the return of D'Lo Brown was that, despite being a popular mid-card act during the 90s and at one point even becoming WWF Tag Team Champions, the Headbangers would not be looked upon fondly by the company in the years after this. No, in fact, they'd be openly criticized, with a 2007 edition of WWE Magazine labeling them as not being worthy of their title reign, and a Raw 15th Anniversary magazine putting them as number 2 on a list of 15 acts who outstayed their welcome. Still, any lingering issues between the parties must have been solved by 2016, because they were seemingly welcomed back with open arms at this point, providing, of course, they were willing to do the job when called upon. And job they did, as after putting over Rhino and Heath Slater in the first round of the SmackDown Tag Team Championship tournament not long after this, they'd immediately sink into obscurity once more, with them only making one further appearance on the November 15th episode of the Blue Brand before they'd disappear altogether. Yes, maybe WWE hadn't undergone as much of a reassessment of the Headbangers as some might have thought, and their initial negative views of them remained after all. But while they might have been only too happy to vocally voice their displeasure about the Attitude Era tag team, there was no man or woman alive who would dare say anything negative about our next entry. And that's because, with him being widely regarded to be the toughest figure in the entire industry, and one feared by pretty much every wrestler he's ever met, when Haku returned in 2001, he'd be allowed to do and say whatever the hell he wanted. Of course, for some context here, we really should take a step back and look at his near-mythical backstory, as across not only his initial late 80s run in WWF when he worked as a member of the Heenan family, but his time in WCW, Japan, and Mexico too, Haku would develop a reputation as being the toughest wrestler to ever lace up a pair of boots. And this wasn't limited to his in-ring work either. No, in fact, some of the stories of his backstage antics over the years have included him no-selling pepper spray from a cop and then getting into a brawl with a group of them, biting a man's nose off at an airport after he'd said wrestling was fake, and generally being so intimidating towards WCW boss Eric Bischoff that he was too scared to fire him. Even Jake the Snake Roberts, one of the tougher guys of his era, would once famously state that if Haku was running towards him and he had a gun and one bullet with which to defend himself, the first thing he would do was to shoot himself in the head, as he didn't want to risk wounding Haku and making him any angrier. So with this reputation then, you'd have thought that when the Tongan wrestler randomly returned to WWE in 2001 to enter himself into that January's Royal Rumble, the company would capitalize on this and push him to a higher level. Sure, during his first run, he hadn't exactly been a main eventer, but he was a former king of the ring nonetheless. And with the internet starting to make the stories of his wild antics easier to come by for fans, there was now a better understanding of just who he was and why he was so respected. Regardless though, after showing up at the Rumble, Haku would do little of note, as after briefly forming a tag team with Rikishi, he'd be moved down to lower tier shows like Heat and Jacked, there performing against the likes of Hardcore Holly and Shawn Stasiak. Then, come April of 2002, he'd be released from his contract again, leaving us all to wonder why Vince McMahon decided to bring him back in at all. But while we would have loved to have been in the room when the boss was building up the nerve to tell Haku he was being fired, we're pretty sure he wouldn't have found the same worries in 2016, as it was then that a less feared group of performers would make an unexpected return to the company, only to be promptly sent packing all over again. Who are we talking about this time? The Spirit Squad, of course. Yes, the Spirit Squad, WWE's resident group of male cheerleaders, a stable who, in their first run with the company during the mid-2000s, would usually serve as little more than cannon fodder to bigger stars like D-Generation X. Of course, even if they did turn out to be a bit of a flop overall, something good would end up coming out of the whole thing when, by 2009, one of their members, Nikki, would be repackaged as Dolph Ziggler. And with a look and style which echoed Curt Hennig then, Ziggler would go on to become one of the top mid-card acts in WWE over the next couple of decades. That said, his past would come back to haunt him at one point when, while he was feuding with The Miz in 2016, the heel would bring in two of his old stablemates in Mikey and Kenny to attack him ahead of their Intercontinental title match. But given how ineffective they'd been before, it really should have come as no surprise that they would fail to do this, and instead, just 5 days later, Dolph would beat The Miz to win the secondary strap. After that, he'd take on his former teammates in a 2-on-1 handicap match, with him soundly beating them here too. Still, this would not mark the end of the Spirit Squad revival, as after that, Mikey and Kenny would get one more chance for glory when they challenged then SmackDown Tag Team Champions Heath Slater and Rhino for the titles on the October 25th episode of the Blue Brand. Unfortunately though, after failing to win this one, the duo wouldn't be long for the company, and by November, they'd be gone altogether, never to return as of the time of this video's recording. But we don't imagine many fans are mourning that, as, with them never exactly being favorites, most have probably already chosen to forget about them by this point. Two people they will never forget, though, are performers who each first rose to prominence in WCW, with one going on to make a bigger name for himself out east in Japan, all while the other created a truly groundbreaking character in WWF, and that's Vader and Goldust. And why are we packaging these two together? Because in 2005, after Vader's short-lived run in WWF had largely flopped, and Goldust's drug issues had seen him be released a couple of years prior, the two would end up returning to Vince McMahon's promotion as a pair. It all began on the October 31st episode of Raw when, in the build-up to a street fight which was supposed to take place between Jonathan Coachman and Stone Cold Steve Austin, the coach would enlist both the Bizarre One and the Mastodon to come back and be in his corner. Of course, this plan would have to be altered somewhat when, after the Rattlesnake decided against coming out of retirement upon realizing he was going to be pinned by his opponent, a last-minute replacement was found in the form of Batista. So with Goldust and Vader's target now shifting, they would set their sights on interfering and attacking Big Dave when the time for the bout came at Taboo Tuesday just 1 day later. And though in the end, this would not be enough to help the coach get the win, it would at least lead to Goldust sticking around for a little while longer and even taking part in the 2006 Royal Rumble. But that wouldn't be the only time two figures from the past had returned to the company together, only for one of them to stick around for a while afterwards, as just a year prior in 2004, it would be the Ministry of Darkness's turn to have a reunion when Gangrel and Viscera re-debuted over on SmackDown. That said, this one wasn't as random as it may have seemed at first, because it was at the point where then WWE Champion JBL was feuding with The Undertaker over the title. So as a former member of the Ministry himself, Bradshaw knew exactly what he had to do to get under his former leader's skin, with this being what led to him calling back in two of their old stablemates on the September 23rd episode of the Blue Brand so as to deliver a beatdown to the dead man. After that, they'd even challenge him in a handicap match, with the returnees ultimately losing here despite their best efforts. But while Gangrel would once again disappear once the bout was over, Viscera would continue on with the company when he was rebranded as the world's largest love machine, a gimmick which got to see him come out to the ring in full Hugh Hefner-style regalia, all while flirting with a number of women on the roster, such as Trish Stratus and Lillian Garcia. So in the end, his return proved to be more than just an obscure event. Of course, we can't say the same for everyone we've covered in this video, however, because as we've shown, many of them have since gone mostly forgotten by fans. But even if they weren't all hits, hell, even if some of them were outright misses, we're still glad they happened, as if nothing else, it was nice to see them again, if only for a little while. Of course, we have to say that about Haku though. We're scared as hell he'll find us if we don't. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.